Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cristel Jusino Diaz, and I am the Director of Research Programs at Centro. I am so excited to welcome you to today's Cafecito con Mónica Jimenez, Making Never Neverland. Jimenez's new book, Making Never Neverland, Race and Law in the Creation of Puerto Rico, examines a larger history of U.S. settler colonialism and racial exclusion in law to better understand the unincorporated territory's current predicament. With us today is the book's author, Mónica Jiménez, a poet and historian who is currently assistant professor in the African and African Diaspora Studies Department at the University of Texas, Austin. Her research and writing explore the intersections of law, race, and empire in Latin America and the Caribbean. Her first book, Making Never Neverland, Race and Law in the Creation of Puerto Rico, was published in 2024 by the University of North Carolina Press. Dr. Jimenez has received fellowships in support of her work from the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, formerly the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Mellon Foundation, among others. In 2021, she was named an inaugural Letras Boricuas Fellow by the Mellon and Flamboyant Arts Foundations. She holds a PhD in history from the University of Texas, Austin, and a JD from the University of Texas School of Law. Her poetry and scholarly writing have appeared or are forthcoming in WSQ, Women's Studies Quarterly, Latino Studies, Centro, Journal of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, Radical History Review, NACLA Report on the Americas, Hayden's Ferry Review, and Essex Salon, among others. Moderating today's conversation is Alvin Padilla-Babilonia, assistant professor at Villanova University Charles Widger School of Law. His scholarship focuses on the constitutional legacy of American colonialism and the relationship between law, race, and empire. He is interested in exploring what we can learn about constitutionalism through the history of colonialism, as well as how constitutionalism constrains democracy and decolonization. Padilla-Babilonia's scholarship has appeared or is forthcoming in the Michigan Law Review, Duke Law Journal, Memphis Law Review, Wyoming Law Review, University of Puerto Rico Law Review, among others. Before joining Villanova, Padilla-Babilonia taught at the University of Puerto Rico School of Law. In 2022, he was selected as a Bridging the Divides Fellow for the Decolonization Study Group funded by the Mellon Foundation and convened by the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. He was also a Yale University Fox International Fellow at the University of San Andrés in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He earned a JSD and an LLM from Yale Law School, as well as a Juris Doctor and a BA from the University of Puerto Rico. He is a member of the New York and Puerto Rico bars. And with that, I leave you with our two wonderful guests today, Mónica and Alvin.
Thank you, Cristel, and thank you, Centro and Mónica, for inviting me to be a host, right? To be a moderator to this wonderful event celebrating Mónica Jimenez's book. Mónica's book is titled Making Never Neverland. I have it right here. I learned a lot from reading this book, and I just want to say like some brief few comments about the book before asking Mónica some questions. So first, I wanted to congratulate Mónica. The book is like incredibly well researched, incredibly well written, and it does something that I think is very important for Puerto Ricans, for people interested in Puerto Rico, which is to connect two histories that are often like not connected in like scholarship, but also in like public debates about these issues. One history is a history of like how Puerto Rico connects to a larger history of racial exclusion in the United States. So in the second chapter of the book in particular, Mónica helps us think of Puerto Rico alongside histories of racial exclusion with regards to Indian nations, with regards to enslaved Africans in the United States, and even African Americans after the war, they won their freedom. And I think that's an important history that I think sometimes Puerto Rico is not connected to, at least in the way we think about Puerto Rico, both in Puerto Rico, but also in academia and in legal scholarship in particular. That's one significant contribution of the book, thinking of Puerto Rico alongside these histories of racial exclusion. The other important contribution of the book, I think, is how Mónica doesn't leave it at that. At the first, she also focuses on how that history of racial inclusion has material and political consequences to the people living in Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans in the United States as well. And she focuses on how the precedents were governing Puerto Rico, right? These ideas of racial exclusion, how they have not only how they are not only still part of the law today, but what are its effects for people living in Puerto Rico and people and Puerto Ricans living in the United States. So here she focuses on topics of economic consequences, political consequences, with regards to policing, with regards to labor, with regards to health. And I think sometimes these two main ideas are also like disconnected, and she helps us see a way to connect these two things, right? To connect this larger history of racial exclusion to how it affects people on the ground, people living in Puerto Rico, Puerto Ricans living in the United States, and also suggests a way forward in terms of how to address these issues in the future, and particularly what possibilities are open up in more recent years with regards to decolonization, with regards to decoloniality, with regards to changes in economy that might be might be important in order to further decolonization in Puerto Rico. So those are the two main highlights that I wanted to mention of the book, and we're going to be talking more about each particular chapter and what are some of these main ideas. I wanted to first ask like one question with regards to where does the idea of the book come from? So basically, in the first in the introduction for the book, Mónica tells a really heartfelt, moving story about moving to the United States, moving to Texas in the mid 1980s, and it made me think, and I know in Mónica as well, it made me think about how all our scholarship, all of our ideas are really shaped by our personal experiences in many ways. So I wanted to ask Mónica how the book is shaped also by her personal experiences, academic and professional experiences, to help us understand what she wanted to contribute with her book.
Thank you. Thank you, Alvin, for that question. Thank you. I want to say first, thank you to Centro for inviting me to do this event, and thank you to all who are in the webinar. It's a really exciting time with this book. I apologize because I have like a cold, allergies. I don't know what. I'm coming off of something, so my voice is really squeaky. So I'm sorry. um, but the book is a very long time coming. So as Christelle mentioned in my bio, I went to law school, ages ago. It seems like, and at that time, this was pre-debt crisis, pre-hurricanes, in a moment where Puerto Rico was in one of its invisible periods. I like to say, right? We have these visible, very visible periods, and then these very invisible periods, and we were in one of these sort of invisible periods. And I went to law school because I wanted to understand Puerto Rico. I didn't want to be a lawyer. I was very clear that I didn't want to do that. That was not the life that I wanted. I just really had this idea that if I studied the law, I would somehow understand this place that I loved, that I kind of longed for. Right? I think the question that you asked about, or the anecdote that you highlight about leaving Puerto Rico as a child, and how many of us have that experience, and that the way that that marks our lives, right? No matter how old you are, there's a sort of before you go and an after, and then there's always a kind of you grappling with what that means. Even if you leave, because you are sick of Puerto Rico and you just got to get out, and you're like, good riddance, right? I'm out. There's still this kind of marking of your life, and so in a lot of ways, I would say the questions that I wanted to ask were about whys, the whys. Why do people have to leave, right? What has transpired in this place that makes it so necessary for so many of us to make that hard decision, and then the consequences of that decision. For me, I was a child. It was not my decision, right? It was the decision of my parents. And in a lot of ways, I had when I was younger, I would often ask myself, like, what would it have been like if we hadn't left? Like, what would my life be like, right? And obviously, I can't know the answer. I can always speculate. Um, but what I know for a fact, and I have to thank my parents for, is I don't think that I would be on the trajectory that I am now, right? The sort of questioning, right, would have been different. And perhaps in such a way that I would never have come to the ideas that I now I'm sort of thinking about in this book that I've just written, right? Um, And so when I went to law school, it was really on a quest. So I started law school in 2003. I'm aging myself here. But when I was graduating from college, and I can't remember which hurricane it was, there was a hurricane that hit Puerto Rico in the like fall of my junior year of college, or like end of summer. And I remember going to Puerto Rico in May, the following May, for a wedding. And driving through some of the mountain roads that were still very much destroyed, and having this conversation with my cousin, who is a very pro-American guy, and he was like very pro-military. We're having this discussion, and I remember being very like naive, being like, why aren't these roads fixed? It's been like 8 months. What's happening here? And his response, hey, la colonia, right? Like the kind of response that we, that is like the common sense of this place. And again, I naively was like, what does this really mean, right? And I have that moment to thank, because it was the moment where I was like, oh, I need to know this. I need to understand what this is. What does it actually mean, La Colonia? Like it's a flippant thing that we say, but also what are the underpinnings of that? And that's why I went to law school. And at the time, nobody was talking about the insular cases. It was just kind of like this forgotten like area of law. The insular cases being the cases that sort of make up the law of the territories, and how the US will deal with its overseas territories. Yeah, so then I discovered those cases, and my world was like, oh, I must understand. And then I just kind of became obsessed with it. Um, I finished law school and went into practice, and I hated my life. Like it was so miserable. I did not want to be a lawyer. I was working at a small firm. And then I was working for the state of Texas, and I just was like, "Oh, this is not my life. This cannot be my life forevermore." Um, and then the financial crisis happened, and I lost my job. And my master's thesis advisor, I ran into him, and he was like, "Hey, what are you still doing in Austin?" I was like, "Well, I was working as at a law firm, and I got laid off." And he's like, "It's a good time to go get your PhD, isn't it?" And I was like, "Yeah, I guess you're right." And so I did. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful that I ran into Frank Caridi, who was then my dissertation chair, who is now at Columbia University. Some of you might know him. Um, and that was it. That sort of opened up this world of like, oh, I can give myself over to these questions now, sort of full time, right? Like this can be the question. So, I often say, and people often say that, we write our obsessions. And so for many, many years, this was my obsession, right? Like I have to understand this. And I will say that I've come away after I don't know how many years now of obsessing over this with many more questions, a few answers perhaps, but still more questions, right? So as we all know, who study Puerto Rico, there's just more questions, and no easy solutions. But I felt at the time when I was researching this that this is something that I wanted to understand, and I wanted to I wanted to bring to other people, right? Like I think everybody needs to understand this. This is important. So that's kind of a short and long answer to how the book comes about, and how, my obsessions bring it to be.
Thank you. And I think like what you were saying resonates with me so much because I graduated law school in 2016. And that's the moment where you mentioned in the book, right, where all these significant things happen with regards to the Supreme Court and La Promesa. And we came to think of ourselves in Puerto Rico as really like, well, no, we're living in a colony, right? A lot of people thought that before. Many of us thought that before, but this was like the first time, as you mentioned in the book, where we kind of like collectively came to realize that, and that it meant something significant for like how we think of ourselves and the possibilities that are still available to us in terms of like how to deal with this, right? Like it brought to the forefront these questions. And I think also like what you were just describing shows how like when you went to law school in the early 21st century, right? Maybe some of these issues were not as important, but now like 15, 20 years later, right? Like now we're like dealing with these issues again, right? Not only at the Supreme Court and Congress, which are important, but not the main thing, right? But in Puerto Rico, in the United States. So I think that context is incredibly important to how it shapes our ideas. I wanted to mention something about the title of the book. So I'm sure everyone knows in this chat, but the book is titled again, Making Never Never Land. And I wanted to ask you, Monica, where does the title come from? And in particular, who is making? Who is making Never Never Land? Is it Congress? Is it the Supreme Court? Is it the Constitution? Is it Puerto Ricans themselves? Who is making this Never Never Land according to the story that you tell in your, or the history that you tell in your book?
Yeah, I love this question. So the title comes from a Supreme Court decision. This, and I talk about it in the last chapter of the book, but in the case of Franklin California Trust et al. Versus Puerto Rico. So this is the case that was decided in 2016. So that June 2016 moment, right, we have these two very important Supreme Court decisions, and then we have Promesa, and they all sort of happen back to back. Well, this Franklin California tax case happens in the middle. So it's like there's one decision, and then there's this decision, and then there's Promesa. And the case was about Puerto Rico trying to pass a bankruptcy law, right? So when the debt crisis begins, or when it becomes public, right? There is a law that's passed in Puerto Rico attempting to deal with bankruptcy or with the debt crisis, right? And it allows for a debt restructuring and bankruptcy for local entities, municipalities, and for Prepa in particular, right? That was like the biggest concern at the time. And so the banks that owned Puerto Rico's debt sued Puerto Rico, right? And said, no, you can't do that. Federal law does not allow you to create your own bankruptcy law. You can't pass your own bankruptcy law. And so I remember when I read this case being like, huh, this is the craziest thing I have ever read, right? And you probably have similar feelings about it, right? It's such a like a catch-22 for Puerto Rico, right? So you can't pass your own bankruptcy law because Congress has said that the states can't pass bankruptcy laws. And for the purpose of this law, you, Puerto Rico, are a state. But there's another provision of this tax code law that allows states to designate an entity as a debtor, right? So this is the debtor is a title that's given to the entity. So the entity can be a municipality, it can be a governmental, like Prepa, right? Like a sort of governmental entity. And in the code, the federal law, it says that Puerto Rico is a state for all the provisions, which means it's considered a state and can't pass its own laws. But it's not a state for this other one provision, which allows the state to say, hey, you, Prepa are a debtor. And since you're a debtor, you can access federal bankruptcy. So it was like the safety valve of this bankruptcy code was that, okay, we're not going to let the states pass laws for bankruptcy, but we are going to allow the state to say, hey, you're in such a bad state, you can access federal bankruptcy. But Puerto Rico can't do that. And so this is the catch-22, right? It can't make its own laws about bankruptcy, and it also can't use federal bankruptcy. And it's such a crazy outcome, right? It's so nonsensical that when this case is being argued before the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, rest in peace, RBG, she says to the lawyer who's making this argument, like she's so dumbfounded, she says to him, why would Congress do this? Why would Congress put Puerto Rico in this never, never land? And I'm like reading the transcripts because, that's what I do for fun, is read Supreme Court transcripts to try to understand. And I was reading the transcripts and I had this moment like mind blown, right? Like even Ruth Bader Ginsburg is like, what the hell? This doesn't make any sense, right? Because it doesn't. And she gave me the title for the book because I was like, yeah, that's what it is, right? It's this kind of like nonsensical, these sort of juridical moments, and this early 19th or 20th century, insular case moment is a similar one. It's these like nonsensical juridical moments that lay bare how irrational this relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico is. And I thought that's a perfect title. And I also thought, and it's a perfect sort of summation of what Never Never Land is, right? So A good friend who many of you know, Marisol Lebron, told me years ago that she hated this title. And I forgive her because I love her. But her point was like, I don't get it. Like, if you haven't read this Supreme Court decision, do you even know what this refers to? And I was like, but that's the beauty because everybody has heard of Never Never Land in the context of like Jay and Barry and Peter Pan, right? So we've heard this term and we have a notion of it being this place that's kind of stuck in stasis, right? Where things can't develop. And I was like, and that to me is perfect, right? Because that's part of the argument that I'm making is that no matter how much the will of the people is change, right? In whatever format that takes, there can be no change while the stasis persists. And the stasis is the Never Never Land, right? And so to the answer to your other question about who makes the Never Never Land, well, I found it ironic, right? Because Ruth Bader Ginsburg was like, why would Congress do this nonsensical thing? And Congress has done many nonsensical things with respect to Puerto Rico, and bankruptcy is just one of them. But the Supreme Court has done an equal amount, if not more, right? And in part, why I find it so ironic is that the designation of Puerto Rico as an unincorporated territory, as this place of like not the U.S., maybe the U.S., maybe someday a state, who knows, right? This kind of pause stasis, that was the Supreme Court. So it's like, yeah, the two together have created this very difficult conundrum. Um, out of which Puerto Rico cannot will itself out of, right? So this is part of the frustration, and you know we're in an election cycle, so I'm always really interested in hearing how people are talking about status in these moments, because no matter how much the local will might be to change something, right? The sort of superstructure that has created this is a bit immovable, at least as it stands, right? It's the never never land. So that's how I sort of understand that, and that's how I came to the title. And you know, maybe people disagree. Um, I thought long and hard about it because I was like, well, you know, I don't want people to think that I think it's impossible for Puerto Rico to change, right? That I'm like foreclosing a possibility because that's not it at all. It's really a critique of the larger structures, the federal and legal structures that have created this situation wherein the will of the people is just flouted again and again and again.
I think the good thing about the title is actually that I think it makes me think of like how we can like undo that. Like if it's a making, like we cannot make it, it's a verb, it's not something that is like permanent. So if there's an act, and there's an act every day of members of Congress, the political elite in the United States, the Supreme Court sometimes, the president, right? They like make these every day, right? They make these policies that keep Puerto Rico in this never never land, right? And it's up to us collectively, right, to kind of like undo that as well, right? So I think I like that part, that the title like kind of like invites that as well. And I think what you're saying, like in terms of like who's making, I feel like the title and the idea of Never Never Land and what you meant describe the story about the Supreme Court case, I think it summarizes perfectly who is actually doing this making, right? Is Congress, and Congress doing this with the powers granted to it by the U.S. Constitution, right? And then the Supreme Court just like legitimizing these arrangements, right? And through that, making this place, right? Making this idea, basically, this concept of a place that is kind of like outside some of these principles of U.S. constitutional law. And I think the way I think of it, it's more about how this whole thing is really, and it's also what your book is about, of course, is how these ideas are not only about Puerto Rico, they're also reflective about the U.S. political system and the U.S. constitutional system, which is, I think, one of the great contributions of the book. And I wanted to ask you something along those lines. So the book is divided into two parts. Part one focuses on the history of racial exclusion, right? There's one chapter on the insular cases, and there's one chapter on Native nations and Dred Scott, the infamous case of the Supreme Court, where it decided many things. Among them, it said that Black people, even those who were freed, were not U.S. citizens. It said that Congress could not abolish slavery in U.S. territories. And you use all those cases, insular cases concerning the Native nations, like the Marshall Trilogy, to present this history of racial exclusion in the United States. And I think I've heard this from people in Puerto Rico, right? Like they think it's kind of like not weird, but like we're not used to thinking of Puerto Rico alongside these groups, right? Or these groups of people who have been like excluded. So I think like one of the questions I wanted to ask you is like, why is this history important, right? Why is it important to think of Puerto Ricans alongside Native nations, African Americans, and all these other racial exclusions?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question. So there, I have many answers to that. I think the first and foremost, right, that um, there is a sense, or there has been, and I hear it less, but for a very long time, there was this kind of rhetoric of exceptionality, that Puerto Rico was this exceptional place, right? Único, and thus very difficult to unravel and very difficult to, it was just so unique. And I had to, I would hear that and I would think, well, yeah, I guess this is true in that like it is still, very much a colony of the US, and that is unique in our 21st century world, right? Um, though, you know, there's many ways that we could argue that it's not that unique, but the kind of legal political territory colony, right, is a unique kind of vestige of a bygone era. Um, this like exceptional status of US citizens that allows Puerto Ricans to come and go. And, I grew up in Texas among in Houston, Texas, where there were at the time very few Caribbean people and very few Puerto Rican people, but a lot of Central Americans and Mexicans, right? And so the experience of migration and of immigration to the U.S. is something that I was very, very cognizant of from a very young age. So, that other sort of exceptional, like, well, we can come and go and we can work and blah, 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 right? And that rhetoric, right? Um, and then when I discovered the insular cases, when I came upon them, and I came upon them as a second year law student, I think, I was doing research on the federal death penalty. And I was just very intrigued by the existence of the federal death penalty, right? Especially in places that had a local opposition to a death penalty. And Puerto Rico is one of those places, right, where the Constitution of Puerto Rico had a sort of a ban on death penalty, but the federal government would attempt to impose it periodically in certain egregious cases. The federal prosecutors in Puerto Rico would really try to put that on the table, and by and large, juries in Puerto Rico rejected it, right? At the time, I haven't kept track of the sort of subsequent case law, so that could have changed. But at the time, I was very intrigued by this. And so I was reading, and again, this is the early 2000s, and there had been a case like a couple of years, maybe not even like 2 years before that moment for me. And this case from, let's say it was from 2000 or 99, something like somewhere in there, was cited in Downs v. Bidwell, this 1901 decision. And I was like, huh, this is curious, like 1901, So I go to Downs and I go to this 1901 decision and I read it. And what stood out to me the most was the way that race was operating in that decision, right? And how, we can say, oh, it's a creature of the early 20th century. And we know that it's the Supreme Court that hands down Downs v. Bidwell is the same Supreme Court, the same makeup that handed down Plessy v. Ferguson, right? The notorious case that sanctions separate but equal, right, in our history, in the US's history. And so that to me was really curious. I was like, huh, what's happening in the Supreme Court and Congress in this moment, right? And so I'd start, I was a law student, but I've always been a historian at heart, right? So I start sort of excavating around this law and this case law. And it's all about race. It's all about race. And to me, I was like, why is nobody writing about this? Why is nobody saying anything about that, right? We're talking about citizenship. We're talking about, constitutionality and all these sort of doctrinal questions of law, but we're never talking about racialization in the way that the Supreme Court in that moment is looking at Puerto Ricans and being like, you guys are like Black folks, and we're going to treat you like Black folks. We understand you to be more akin to African Americans than to anything else. And so this is how we sort of get around giving you full rights or really considering you full citizens, right? We're not ew, no, we can't make you full citizens, right? And in that moment, I was very intrigued. And when I wrote sort of my next iteration of that project was a master's thesis, I went into the constitutional record because I was like, well, I want to know how Puerto Rico was being discussed in that moment. And again, it's all about race. And then as I continued to study law and sort of have a bit more sophistication, I realized that like, oh, this case is, I mean, this case is citing Native American law and it's citing Dred Scott v. Sanford, right? I have to know why, which then means I have to go read those cases and I have to go see what is happening. And so, you know, in a very real way, I'm letting the decision, this very important decision, right, that makes Puerto Rico what it is today, I'm letting it lead me to the answers, right, or to the questions and the answers. And it's leading me straight to a history of settler colonialism and native dispossession and African American disenfranchisement and African American exclusion and enslavement and all of the sort of ignominious, you know, sins of this country, of the US. And I was like, of course, of course. You don't get a 21st century colony, right? Or a 20th century colony and all of that history without the way that this country developed through Native exclusion, through African American exclusion and oppression and violence, right? And so, of course, you know, I'm young and like hyped up, and I'm like, it's all the same, you know. And I'm like, it's not all the same, right? And so, I hope that the book is able to nuance that, right? That I've learned some, and to be able to say it's not, you know, some people like to argue, and I've heard this argument from different sources that, you know, oh, Puerto Rico is just like a native reservation. No, that's not true, right? But there is a legacy there, right? A legal genealogy, I call it, right? Where you get the foundational sort of ideas from native dispossession, and then they are perfected and changed and made more contemporary, perhaps, and the titles and the names that we use change, but the ideas have that sort of genesis. And so I saw very clearly that in order to really understand what it is that happened in that early 20th century moment in Puerto Rico, you had to understand this history of native dispossession and of African American dispossession and disenfranchisement and of settler colonial violence, right? You just had to. And some people don't like that argument. I've had people push back, right? The people don't like, but to my understanding and the research that I've done, it makes a lot of sense, right? It is there and it is obvious and apparent if you just want to investigate it. So that's why I set out to do it in that way, right? One, because I think we have to kind of break out of these narratives of exceptionality and being exceptional, but two, because it seems so obvious to me. And so I have been lauded, right? People love that the book is accessibly written. And I have also been sort of chastised, like, oh, this is, you know, not written like an academic text. And that is by design, right? And I think if I get chastised for not writing it like an academic text, then I've won, right? That I've done the thing that I wanted to do because to me, it seems so important for us to understand not just the racialized history of Puerto Rico, but the way that it connects to this larger history of race in the US. And that's not a story that I want only academics to know, right? That's a story that I want everyone who cares about these places and these topics to know. Um, and if I had written it in a very sort of historical, citational, sort of academic way, then that would have been lost. And so I hope that it travels, right? That it is accessible and that people can easily come and be like, and then I can walk them through the connections that I've seen, right? Anyways, that's a long answer, but
No, I agree with you on this. Like, I think that history is important, but I think like what you're doing in an amazing way is in the book is what you're saying, like treating in an accessible way, people can understand who the characters of these cases are, what were their lives, how these cases affected them. So you connect it in like a more like individual, personal level, but also connected to like this broader history of the U.S. about settler colonialism, Indian dispossession, slavery. And I think those are the big questions that we need to asking ourselves. not only from the context of Puerto Rico, but also in the context of the United States and the world in general, right? So I feel like those connections are really important. There's something that you mentioned about the death penalty that I think is really interesting, because in a way, like the death penalty example is an instance of like the US federal law trying to impose its views on Puerto Rico, also on the other states, right? But particularly in the context of Puerto Rico, right? That is a colony that does not vote for the members of Congress and president. And that sorts of those sorts of impositions is something that is part of your book as well, right? And there's one like if part one focuses on this history of racial exclusion, part two focuses more on Puerto Rico, right? You describe this how Puerto Rico made, remade, the birth of the Estado Libre Asociado, the death of the Estado Libre Asociado. And there's one chapter in particular where you focus roughly on like the first 40, 50 years of the 20th century, right? And these are the years before El ELA, but Puerto Rico is a US colony, right? And I think this is the part of the book that I found the most interesting, because it's maybe the part of it that I'm less familiar with. But I think you also describe like all these US experiments, policies with regards to the Puerto Rican population, with regards to labor, with regards to policing, with regards to labor. But you also mentioned something that I thought is really important, and it's important to think about Puerto Rico for us today as well, which is all these policies were also like resisted. They were resisted through like labor strikes. They were resisted through political mobilization. You talk in the book about writing letters. The workers in the United States, the Puerto Ricans who were working in the United States, they were writing letters through the resident commissioner, right, to the comisionado residente. And it made me think like how in that particular moment, right, people were like actively resisting, right? And they are actively resisting today as well, right? But it made me think about what can we learn about those histories that you tell about the early 20th century for today, right? What are the lessons that we can learn that are valuable for Puerto Ricans today?
Yeah, I love that. I think that something that I think a lot about is, and I say this to my students every semester, and I say it and I repeat it, and they all know it now. It's like my catchphrase. But I say to them, we study the past to understand the present, right? We study our former selves so we can understand ourselves. And the sort of the impulses are similar, right? We have different technologies, and sometimes we have more knowledge, but we're fundamentally, kind of the same people, right? We're not like a different species. um, so the things that motivate us are the same, right? Wanting to feel, the comfort, right, and safety, and to be satiated in life, to have, to provide the best for our children, right? And as individuals, right? And all of the kind of political decisions that we make in pursuit of those sort of aims. Um, and that I don't to me hasn't changed, right? So when we look back at the early 20th century in Puerto Rico, one of the moments that I think is astounding, and it is I don't know if actually I don't remember if this makes it into the book. I think I cut it, but in my dissertation I did all this research on educational policies. And and one of the things that I found fascinating was that in that early 20th century moment, um, there's this question of how are we going to teach these kids to be proper American citizens, right? And Sorciri del Moral has written about this in a really beautiful way in her book. But this question of how can we use education as a tool to Americanize these kids, right? And so they start imposing all these language policies across the primary into secondary. And what they find and what happens is that children begin to resist. So it's not just the adults that are resisting these impositions, right? It's the kids too. And not just the older kids in the high school levels, right? This goes all the way down to elementary school kids who understand in their bodies, right, and in their ways. They might not have had the language for it, but they understand that this is an imposition that they reject. And I absolutely love that. I remember being in the archives and finding these letters, these stories, like, different officials writing, oh, the mayor of such and such town, Guayama, wrote a letter that these elementary school kids had taken down the US flag at their school and hidden it, right? Like, brilliant little acts of resistance from our youngest, right? And I think there is a lesson in that, right? Which is that people will make themselves and their will known, right? And resistance can come in all shapes and sizes. And it's not just about how we resist at the political level, how we resist as adults. But sometimes, we see it across ages that there is a sense of like, this isn't right, what is happening, right? And so I take a lot of heart from sort of looking back at what our elders have done and how they've done it. And and what that can teach us about things. So I write a lot about nationalism as well. It's this, if I have two sort of strains of ideas and obsessions, one is this kind of legal question, legal historical question, and the other is this like nationalist resistance. um and I love going back sometimes and reading what some of the nationalists were saying in the 30s that so resonates with what the world that Puerto Rico is living now, right? The way that capitalism has exploded in such like ways that we could not have imagined, right? And shapes our lives in ways that are so vastly different from the 1930s, and yet are reproducing very similar sort of dynamics of inequity and impoverishment. And the way that labor has sort of, re or the power of laborers has sort of been uh, so like weakened, right? That we are once again in this moment of like organizing, right? Where you see people organizing across sectors in like, coffee shops, the like Starbucks baristas organizing, right? TAs at universities, right? So it's this really interesting moment that, and I see a lot of sort of signaling back to earlier moments in U.S. and global history, really, and in the history of capitalism, I guess, in some ways, right? And I think that there's something to be learned about the ways that people organized in the past, how they resisted in the past, how they kept themselves safe, right? Our world is very different, but some of the tactics are still, the surveillance state is still the surveillance state, right? So yeah, I think there's something really powerful about sort of looking to our past to find some of the ways forward, for sure. And in a place like Puerto Rico, where I think, we see the kind of the cyclical nature of some of these experiments, right? Like economic experiments, like all of these opportunity zones, right? Look a lot like some of the tax incentives that that we've seen in the past, right? So, nothing is new. So in that way, I think it makes a lot of sense to really excavate our past to see how we might make the way forward.
That's great. And I actually want to ask a question about, and this is going to be my last question before we open the Q&A up, but a question about this way forward, right? In the last two chapters of the book, you talk about the birth of the ELA and then the Estado Libre Social, and you talk about the death of the ELA in 2016. And you also explain like how we got there, right? Or how we got here, right? How like it was not something like at the time, 2016, and as I mentioned, I was graduating from law school at the time. I remember like some of the law school professors, they were like, oh, these cases are not gonna mean anything, the cases of the Supreme Court. But then they realized like the answers that the Supreme Court was providing, right, were like very telling as well, right? So collectively, we came to realize like this political project was coming to its end. At the same time, this opens maybe new possibilities about what to deal with these issues. And you describe in the book like how exactly that was not something that happened suddenly, but something that took like decades of economic policies to get us to this moment of significant Puerto Rican debt and so on. But I wanted to ask you one last question about like where do we go from here, right? So towards the end of the book, you talk about this idea of like what it would mean to like overrule these cases, overrule the insular cases, overrule Downs, what political avenues it would open up in terms of like how to address the issues of Puerto Rico. And so I think one way I'm going to try to frame the question is overruling insular cases would require like judicial engagement, right? It would require the Supreme Court to address these issues, right? And I wanted to ask you, like, what do you think are like the limits and possibilities of the Supreme Court, like, be the one that deals with these issues? And also, I wanted to say something maybe about the present moment, and particularly after like the last 8 years after 2016. And what do you think is going on right now? What alternatives do you see today that were not even conceivable in 2016. So like help us maybe like connect the story, that the history that you describe in the book, with like what are the paths forward to maybe collectively deal with these issues.
Yeah, yeah, saving the hard questions to the end, friend. Well, this is something you and I have talked a lot about, and I think it is a hard question, right? It's a question that I think everyone wants the answer to, and none of us have that answer, unfortunately. I do think, in terms of the insular cases, I think it matters very much, right? I think it's not the only thing that has to happen, right? But I do think it matters. And it matters from a kind of symbolic perspective, right? Um, but it also matters from a kind of legal pragmatic perspective, right? Because I'm thinking of the last case that I write about in my conclusion, that Bahia Madero case, which was about SSI benefits, right? And so, very briefly, this man lives in New York City. He is receiving Social Security insurance based on some disability or accident or something. He decides to move to Puerto Rico, and so he does, and his SSI benefits continue to arrive in his bank account, no problem, he thinks. He's living in Puerto Rico. A couple years later, he applies for Social Security, right? He's like of the age now, he's retired, and now he is eligible for Social Security. And when he applies, the Social Security agency realizes he's been receiving SSI in Puerto Rico, which is not allowed by their laws, right? And so they then sue him for, I think it's like $32,000 or something in back pay of SSI payments that he got while in Puerto Rico. And he sues, he countersues, and he's like, listen, equal protection, right? So the equal protection clause of the Constitution says that similarly situated individuals must be treated similarly, right? So for him, it's like, the argument is it's unconstitutional to treat people with disability differently in Puerto Rico than it is in the 50 states. And it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, and this is where I think these things matter, right? That Congress can discriminate against Puerto Ricans and Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico if they have a rational reason, right? A rational basis for doing it. So, equal protection generally, right? If we're talking about race, and if we're talking about gender discrimination, racial discrimination, religious discrimination, it requires what we call strict scrutiny, right? So strict scrutiny means there has to be a really, really, really good reason why you're discriminating against this person in order for it to be allowable. And so the fact that Puerto Rico's unincorporated territorial status created by the Supreme Court allows Congress the power to sort of pick and choose what it will apply to Puerto Rico and what it will not. In this case, it's a fairly inequitable outcome, right? This man is eligible for SSI disability payments while he's in New York. The minute he moves to Puerto Rico, he's not, based solely on the fact that he's in Puerto Rico, right? But Congress can choose to do that because they have a reason, right? For reasons, as we say, you see on like social media memes, reasons. Doesn't matter what those reasons are, right? And there are similar sort of moments, and it usually comes about in the area of social benefits that Congress can deny to Puerto Ricans living in Puerto Rico based on reasons. And so I think in those instances, which are not insignificant, especially when you think about how aged the population of Puerto Rico is, right? And how many rely on those types of benefits, that actually has a significant impact. So in cases like that, right, I do actually think it makes a difference. Now, it also isn't everything, right? And this is what you and I have talked about, is like, it's not everything. And I agree, it's not everything. But I do think it's a step towards unraveling the Never Never Land, right? A big step. Then there is obviously questions of politics and larger status questions, right? Like what happens next. But I think the sort of inequality that was built in that early 1900 moment, that 1901 Downs moment, does have material and real consequences for people living in Puerto Rico that will not be sort of undone overnight, but can start to be taken apart once those structures start to be taken apart. But in terms of like future and what I take a lot of hope from what's happening in Puerto Rico. It's not clean by any means, right? But I think the discourses have changed, right? The fact, as you mentioned earlier, right? People's very clear understanding that they live in a colony, right? Whereas before we had that kind of like, the glean of the Ella, the fantasy that, Munoz Marin loved to sell of like, oh, we could have it all. We can have the best of both worlds, right? That's gone. And I think that's a huge step in dealing with the reality, right? Is like you have to undo the fictions and the kind of um, the narratives that we tell ourselves and deal with what's actually before you. Yeah, I don't know. I have a lot of thoughts, but I'll stop there. Um, yeah.
Perfect, thank you. And we can circle back to that question
And I
about the
feel like
case
it
and what
will.
it
I
means.
feel like the question is going to come up again in the Q&A, which is fine. We can all collectively think about it.
There are three questions. I'm gonna go in the order that they were asked. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So the first question is, how can Puerto Rico's status as a never land change with La Alianza if successful in the elections?
Ah, well, it's funny. I have been keeping track of what's been happening in Puerto Rico and thinking about this. I think local elections are really important, right? Like, like paramount. Um, and I do think that people's everyday, the way that people relate to their local government, um, has deep impacts, right? Like who you choose really does matter, right? Um, in the question of status, however, I mean, it matters in respect to like what that person wants. So, Jennifer Gonzalez is if what she wants is to become a state, I guess that does matter, of course, and her like politics very much matter, right? And like the vision that she has for Puerto Rico very much matters. So I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but vis-a-vis the status question, right? Which is I think what people are very concerned about is how can maybe this progressive movement like impact the status question. I really don't know the answer because the pessimist in me is like, it doesn't matter who's in power in Puerto Rico in terms of status. It matters very much in terms of the local, right? So I want to be very clear that I'm not saying like, oh, it doesn't matter. No, it matters very much. But in terms of the federal Puerto Rico relationship, right? It matters, I think, less. And so this is, I'll tell you why, right? So to move back in time, right? When Ricardo Rosselló ran, right? And it was like a super consequential election in Puerto Rico, super consequential election in the US, right? And we got Trump and we got Ricardo Rosselló. And I remember the rhetoric at the time, and people were like, well, pro statehood people were like, this is the guy, Ricky Rosselló is going to get it done. He's the guy that's going to get it done. And Trump is the president that's going to make it happen because he's got all these business interests in Puerto Rico and he's got a history with Puerto Rico. And this is gonna happen, right? And everyone really thought that this was like the best possible like relationship. Of course, Hurricane Maria happened and everything got upended. But even before that, I was like, this is so delusional, right? Like, it's not up to Ricky Rosselló. It's not up to the governor to make it done. It's like asking this, like, it's not, right. It has to have, there has to be federal will, there has to be, at least in the structure as it exists today. Right now, if the structure looks different, then it's a different conversation, but what is in place right now requires a federal effort, and we know it's not there. It's just not, in part because of the structure that exists, right? That like there's no representation, so there's no constituents. There are no constituents that would that could force something to happen. I don't know. Like I think about this a lot, and I don't want to ramble, but I think about this question a lot because I think local elections matter very much, and part of what I think is really um, like hopeful, right? That I take hope from, and that I think is really cool, that I saw happen post Maria. And it's a double edged sword because I think the reason it happens is because people have given up on the structures of power, you know, responding to them, but is in the need to saying, you know what, we're not going to look at this we're not going to sort of keep asking for the federal solution, right, or the status solution. We're just going to focus on the local, and we're going to try to make our communities the best that we can. And you know, that isn't a long-term solution in that like climate change is outside of us, right? Like it's not, and federal policies matter. But I think the kind of the focus on I'm trying to find a careful way of wording this because I want to be clear. I don't want to be misunderstood, and I feel like you can be misunderstood in making these arguments. But I think that the status question as it has existed and as it exists today, it will not be resolved by petition. And I think that's what we have seen in the past. Petition, right? Petition pro statehood, petition against statehood, whatever. The politics are the politics. It has been petitions along the spectrum. And I think it was Albizu Campos who said a long time ago, we cannot, our status will not be resolved by asking, right? That was his whole argument, was like, you know, armed violence is necessary because we've been asking, and asking hasn't gotten us anywhere. And I kind of agree with him. You know, we've been asking for a long time in all of these ways, right? And in all these juridical ways, right? Holding plebiscites is just another form of asking, right? Because when we take in the past, right, when we take the sort of here, this is the will of the people, you know, Congress can say, okay, cool, thanks for that, next thing. I don't know, maybe I'm pessimistic about this. Alvin, what do you think? Don't leave me in the wind by myself. I'm like, oh God.
Yeah, maybe I can say something about the question. And the question was again, like how Puerto Rico status as a never land, right? Which is the title of the book, the concept of the book, can shape with La Alianza, if the Alianza were successful. And I think I would avoid the question but say something relevant to it, which is that
I love that.
I think La
Next
Alianza,
time, I'll just avoid the question.
Yeah. I think La Alianza is kind of like representative of some of the things that you're describing in your book, right? Which is that 2016 marked an important political moment in how we think about Puerto Rico and what the solutions for Puerto Rican's issues should be, right? Mm-hmm. And I feel like right now in 2024, we're coming to see like the full effect of those 8 years of policies that have not worked for Puerto Rico and the people of Puerto Rico, and at least organizing politically, but also through social movements, trying to head on address some of these issues, right? Mm-hmm. So I feel like in a way they're trying to unmake or undo this never land. And I feel like if the Alianza were successful, to me, it would signal that it's not that the status is not an issue, or that Puerto Rico is not a colony. It's a complete opposite, right? It's like, no. Puerto Rico, it is a colony, like everyone in the Alianza thinks that. But what do we need to do in order to deal with the problems of colonialism? And they're not only, to go to your point, they're not only about having a plebiscite and trying to communicate and collaborate with Congress on how to deal with these issues. It needs to be about how we collectively determine our futures, right? So I think, like, in a way, that's how I think about how these issues are like connected, without it being like it would mean that we would be independent, right? I think we both agree, like it would not mean that.
No, and I agree with you, right? I do think that a progressive movement that is focused not on the politics, of the state, right? Like of a state making, or of, you know, an economic capitalist sort of, you know, recreating a kind of capitalist economic project in Puerto Rico, but is concerned with how do we survive, right? How do we live? How do we thrive? I think that's a powerful movement, right? And I've been keenly like watching and being like hesitantly hopeful, right? Like I never want to get my hopes too high up because you never know what's going to happen, but I agree with you. I agree with you that, like, and this is why I say I agree that it matters very much what happens on the local. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for
that. There's 3 more questions in the Q&A right now, or maybe 4. Yeah, 4. So the second question is, do you see any parallels or analogous situations between Palestine and Puerto Rico? That's the second question.
Yeah, absolutely, of course. And again, without um, flattening the very different contexts in which these struggles have developed, and the way that these places have developed, right? As non-sovereign states, right? I'm like, it's not states, right? That's not, but as non-sovereign state entities. Um, so that, the histories are very particular, but the structures are very similar, right? And I think that, colonialism is colonialism, right? And we can dress it up and call it other things, but the structures that, would make us one state or one people subjugate another are very similar, right? So, and I'm not an expert in Palestine. I don't work in Palestine, but I very much follow the work of those who do, right? Sarah Wartani is the one that comes to mind most, who has been writing about this for some time, and really making explicit the parallels between Puerto Rico and Palestine, as well as between Puerto Ricans and Palestinians, right? The places and the people. Um, so yes, absolutely. I see many, many parallels. And also, a long history of understanding those parallels and understanding solidarity, right? Not just in Puerto Rico, but within Puerto Rican communities in the US, right? Um, yeah, so I think it's something that I find really again hopeful, to see when the solidarities that have sort of been made visible in this really difficult and horrific moment in Palestine. Yeah, that's all I say about that.
There's another question that I think I'm going to read it, but I think it connects to some of the things that you discussed in your fourth chapter. The question is, how has Puerto Rico's local government inherited governance methods of the colonizer U.S. government, such as austerity? So basically, what has the local Puerto Rican local government inherited from the government's methods from the U.S. government?
Oh, that's such a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting. It's an interesting question. The the Let me think about this. The operations, I think there's at once like the question of what do we come up with that is uniquely organic to Puerto Rico, right? That is trying to govern on the governmental level, that is trying to address the local concern, and then what is sort of imposed and strongly recommended, right? And so I think certainly at the state or the like archipelago level, you see the use of tax incentives is something that has we've been doing for decades and decades and decades, right? Repackaging them, right? Sort of sometimes they're for certain industries, sometimes they're for other industries, sometimes they're for certain people. Um, and that's something that began, I mean, I don't know, maybe the Spanish crown was doing something similar. I can't actually speak to that because I don't know that history, but I do know that in the early 20th century, the US was certainly creating those types of structures, right? So I don't know how much of that is, inherited as sort of um, or nativized, for lack of a better word, right? Sort of made part of the common sense of Puerto Rico on a governmental level. But I think that's a really interesting question, and I think that Jose Atiles' new book might actually be able to answer some of those questions more directly. So, Crisis by Design is his book, and it's coming out now. I think in November is the official publication date. But he does a lot of that work of looking at the kind of the local level, the kind of the at the various levels, federal and local, and seeing that interplay of law and the ways that law is sort of um, being created and recreated and repackaged. Yeah. So I look forward to reading it for those answers as well, because I don't know the local so very much.
I think I would add just from your book, again, chapter 3, I think it is actually, that you talk about, for example, with regards to the education system, or with regards to labor, or with regards to policing. Puerto Rico basically, well, Puerto Rico did not adopt, like, right, like the U.S. government kind of like imposed some of those ways of thinking about it, and then you still see this with regards to like labor protections, for example, in Puerto Rico, right? And you see La Junta demanding basically some neoliberal policies with regards to labor, and they want to like and Puerto Rico at the time had like really like not, it was not like, you know, social democracy country where like significant labor protections, but basically uh the US, the Puerto Rican local government through the junta, I guess, right? Or because of the junta is imposing some of these policies, they're definitely like adopting some of the policies that are more common in the states, right? In terms of like how to deal with the issues of the economy, labor, and education, and policing, and so on. Is some of the examples that I think you can see in your book as well. You were talking in your answer about tax incentives, and there one of the questions is about this. I'm gonna try to like summarize it, but I think maybe you can read the question as well, or maybe I can send it to you. Um, but basically, the question asks about how throughout Puerto Rican history, Puerto Ricans or Puerto Rican government has used kind of like tax incentives to incentivize the economy, incentivize employment. You still see this with like Act 20, Act 22, that is now Act 60, right? Like all these incentives to bring American companies, or even like US citizens, right, to like live in the United States with the hope that it would create employment. So the question asks about what are the negative system effects of those tax incentives, particularly in regards to the lack of stability for employment, and the negative effects of climate change. They say of like bringing these companies, these corporations, these pharmaceutical companies that you talk about in the book as well. So
Mm.
what?
Yeah, it's okay. So I'm gonna connect that to what we were just talking about with the question of the local, right? Because something you said made me think like it's hard to unravel what is, and I just said, I called it organic or like, Puerto Rico based with what is coming from a federal, right? Because of that early 20th century, right? Pre-ELA, pre-Estado Libre Asociado, when Puerto Rico was just a colony, right? Like a traditional colony in that sense, where it was very much like US imposed governance. And so many of the experimentation right, is what I call it, in that time period was about trying to make Puerto Rico, well, couple things, right? Trying to make Puerto Ricans, I argue, a kind of healthy working body, right? Like how to make Puerto Ricans productive workers. And then to the next point, how to make them healthy workers so that then we can make the max profit from our colony, right? And maybe that's a cynical way of thinking about it, but and one of the things that I do say in the book is that like some of these advances, like advances in medicine, helped Puerto Ricans, right? But the ultimate aim was let's make these folks healthy so that they can be good workers, productive workers, and let's make them a productive American subjects, right? So I say that because from that perspective, if you think about that history and the kind of aim in that early 20th century moment, I don't know that you could ever argue the colonial structure is interested in creating a healthy society, right? A, a functioning society that it functions for itself, right? If the aim is let's help these Puerto Ricans be healthier, let's help them be more productive, let's help them be more better American subjects, right? Not citizens, American subjects. So if you think about that and you connect it to these like tax incentive moments, then it's an easy kind of straight line to see that like, oh, it's never about the health and well and well-being of Puerto Ricans for the sake of them being humans who deserve rights and deserve health and well-being. It's about a capitalist enterprise. Maybe that's overly cynical, but I think that that's true. And I think it's still true because Puerto Rico is still a colony, right? And the structures are still there. They look different maybe, but the structures are still there. I mean, Downs doesn't look different. Downs looks the same, right? And the Ella for a time made it look different, but now we know the Ella's sort of failed to live up to its promises anyway, right? And we have La Junta, which is there to undermine the Ella in any case. So I think we have a very like if you take that view of like, okay, well, what's the aim of a colony? It's never been, and we can look back to colonialism 1.0, right? Early modern colonialism and the colonization of the Caribbean. The aim was never about the local society thriving and being healthy and well. It was about extractive practices, and we're still living in those structures. So in that context, these laws that incentivize wealthy Americans to come and bring their wealth and contribute absolutely nothing to Puerto Rico, right? Make no jobs, make no like interventions that actually help Puerto Ricans, then that actually that doesn't seem far-fetched in that kind of trajectory of of thinking about what colonialism is, what it's meant, what the aim is, right? That doesn't mean that within that there aren't individuals, right? So we're talking about structures, and then there's the question of individuals and what individuals are doing within those structures. And there are always individuals within those structures who are, of course, much more concerned with the human population, right? The well-being of individuals and how we thrive. But the system itself is not concerned with that. And these tax incentives live within that system. So I don't know. I think I've answered the question, but I also feel like maybe I went off on a tangent. I'm sorry. I'm like coming off this cold and my brain fog is real right now.
No,
So
you're good. I think that really answered the question of how uh, who are these tax incentives for us and how they're representative also of like Puerto Rico's situation as a colony and how it fits with like these global patterns and national patterns in regards to the US of like capitalism and how it moves from one place to another and try to like get some of these like tax incentives. There's one last question in the Q&A. I think we still have like 8 minutes. The last question is a really big one. How do we address infrastructure regardless of the status question?
that is a big one and an important one. And also related to the previous question, right? Because one of the things it asked was about climate change, right? And I think that's the conundrum of our era, right? Which is places like Puerto Rico that are smaller and don't have the political heft, but that are most impacted by climate change. And so that, here are these great ideas that are coming, right? Great ideas that are coming from the federal government or, the local Puerto Rican government about, oh, let's develop, for example. And every time I go to Puerto Rico and I encounter zones like this, I'm like, who thought this was a good idea? Let's, for example, develop the wetlands, right? So let's just, "Ay, estos manglares aquí, we don't need those. Let's build here." Right, with then the consequence being that you have now completely devastated the barrier, right? The shock absorber of your island, right? And now you no longer have the kind of wetlands that function as a natural barrier to, climate change. And you just have concrete, right? And so those are the types of like infrastructure questions that are really difficult, right? Because and I think this is where it matters who your local elected officials are, right? Like it matters very much whether it's, you know, PNPs or La Alianza, right? Because the vision, right? The capitalist vision of like, how do we develop so that we can bring more money, right? For the few versus, whoa, we need to actually be planting more mangroves, right? Because mangroves actually protect us and they protect from storms and historically, right? That we know that. So I think it's a really pressing question and a difficult one to answer, but I think what I see on the community level that I think is really important is as a re-education, right? A sort of reconsidering like, whoa, what did we used to do that actually worked, right? Because yes, climate change is happening, but there's also like historical knowledge that we have always had about how to survive hurricanes, for example, right? and reinvigorating those ideas, right? Renaturing, right? They call it rewilding certain populations where there's sort of certain land where it's like, oh no, if we take it back to its original status, it will protect, right, against storm, it will protect against, it will bring back water, it will bring back animals, whatever it is. And I'm stuck on mangroves because a friend of mine is doing a project on mangroves right now. And, I have these distinct memories of like going to the beaches and swimming in the mangroves. And, and I don't think we ever talk about how important that like environmental biome is, what it does, what it physically does for the islands. Um, so I don't know. I mean, I think the infrastructure question is a really difficult one and one that's really important and one that I think we'll see play out in terms of on the local level, like who wins these elections, what they allow for, right? Like what is their vision? I think that in that case, like having visions, right, for how you want your community to look and working with it with people within your community to try to make those visions possible is important. The question of like the giant capitalist structure that really cares very little about climate change, that's the scary thing, right? And it's something that causes me sort of existential dread too. I live in a very drought prone area that is continues to expand and grow and grow and grow, and there's not enough water, right? So, we have the opposite problem here. You guys are drowning in water after the storms. We are constantly riddled with drought. And it's a real question because people keep moving here and there's this like sense from the city of Austin that like it's all good. I'm like, no, it's not. Like we don't have enough water. We don't have enough water for the people who live here. Um, so I really, really think a lot about how do you make the urgency that we, I think, as individuals and as communities feel, how do you translate that to this kind of capitalist machine, right? That is just like, no, it's good that we're building more. It's good that we have more people coming. It's good that there's more workforce and business and whatever, whatever. So I don't have a good answer to that question other than to say that it is one that is so vital and important, and I think we must, right? We have to think about. And I love that it's framed as infrastructure, right? Because infrastructure seems like such a boring, like, oh, infrastructure, such a boring word, but it's so, so urgent right now. Yeah.
Well, I think we're almost at 3:30, so I don't know if there's anything else, Monica, that you want to say about your book, uh, about what you want people to take away from the book. 2 minutes left, so anything you want to share? And then thank you again for the invitation to be part of this conversation. Again, I really love the book. I really recommend it. I think it really helps us, all of us, not only people who are like, academics and so on. Like it helps all of us to connect these issues and to really think about them deeply and try to look for try to, like, by understanding the history, as you said, try to like understand our present moment and how we can hopefully dream or imagine new political futures for ourselves that are not what we have inherited from these histories of racial exclusion as well. So I feel like I take your book in the end to be really optimistic in that sense, and I thank you for sharing that, your ideas with us, and how you also, like, I think it's one of the things that I enjoy about it the most, like how you connect with the material so personally as well, and how that helps the audience, right, connect with it in a deeper level as well. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm grateful. I'm grateful to people who have read it and those who want to read it. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to talk about it. Um, and yeah, I hope that people will come to it with an open heart, and take heart in it. And I'm glad that you see ultimately as optimistic. I'll say, and my dad started to read it and I was so touched because I was like, my dad is reading my book, my academic book. Okay. And he came to me and he said, I had to put it down because it made me so angry. And I was like, yeah, I get that, right? And he's a laborer, right? He's not, I doubt very seriously he's ever studied like American history with any kind of but I had this moment where I was like, okay, that's good. you should feel angry, but keep reading, right? Because it's not just about like the anger and the like, it is about hope and about making futures, right? Other futures and other worlds and world making and unmaking the Never Never Land. So thank you for framing it in that way, Alvin. And thank you to everyone who was here today and to Centro for hosting. I'm very grateful.
Well, I guess that's it. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.